to continue with Alan, who didn't learn to drive until he's 35, right? Our next speaker flew a plane before he ever drove a car. Yes. Please welcome Travis.
Everybody for coming. That is a much cooler fact than it sounds like. My neighbor had a plane and he let me take the controls briefly when I was a kid. Okay, so I'm Travis Riddle. I'm a senior research fellow at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And today I'm going to talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing to better understand who the folks are who are using our complaint program and why, if any of you are working with data that are kind of like just generated by happenstance or are otherwise, you suspect, unrepresentative of the population you're interested in, that you can use some of the methods that I'm going to show you today to to understand the ways in which your sample might be different from the population. Okay. Typical disclaimer, I work for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I'm doing this presentation as a representative of the Bureau, but the opinions and views are my own and may not represent the CFPB's views. Okay, so this is basically everything I'm going to tell you today. Just from here on out, it's just filling in details that aren't here. So if you fall asleep and somebody asks, hey, what did the CFPB guy say? You can basically just tell them these bullet points, and that's like that's 95% of what you're going to take home today. So the things that I'm going to talk to you today about are, first, that complaints are widely used at the Bureau and among third parties. So that's other government agencies and just people in the general public. But we don't really understand why some people complain and some people don't, even given similar or perhaps even identical sets of circumstances. And so in order to identify the ways in which consumers who submit complaints are different from those who do not, but have similar circumstances, we're going to use something called a case control study design and a survey instrument that we developed in-house and cognitively tested before distributing to the public. Our findings are going to show a lot of ways in which consumers who submit complaints are different from consumers who don't submit complaints, but also have similar issues. And then finally, I'm going to emphasize again that if you find yourself in a situation where you have some kind of data set that you suspect is not representative or is generated by people opting in, then you might consider doing something like this to understand how that selection process is playing out. Okay, so that's everything I'm going to talk about. Like I said, from here on out is just filling in the gory details. So fall asleep if you want, and you'll basically know what I'm going to say. So one of the things that the CFPB does, one of the primary functions of the CFPB is collecting, investigating, and responding to consumer complaints. If you have a problem with like your bank account or your credit card or your mortgage, and your financial services provider, your bank or your company is not providing you service in the way that you would like to, like they're not paying attention to your phone calls or your emails or whatever, you can submit a complaint to the Bureau, and we will make sure that the company attends to you and responds to you. They're required by law to do that. So these complaints over time have turned into a widely used data source at the Bureau and in other places. And we share these complaints, like I said, with other regulators and with a subset are shared with the general public. Okay, but even though these complaint data are widely used at the Bureau and a lot of other places, like I've been alluding to, they're hindered by a phenomenon known as selection bias. So I'm sure many of you probably know what that is, but in case you don't, given that somebody has a complaint with a financial product or service and does not receive satisfactory help from that service provider, we're not sure why some people would submit a complaint to us and why some people wouldn't. And without knowing about how that happens, it's really hard to take the data, to take anything that we calculate from the data that we've got from the complaints that we have and generalize that to a broader population. Because we don't know how people are getting into our program, it's going to make it really a lot more difficult to generalize from the sample that we've got to the broader population of people or the broader population of financial institutions that we regulate. So just to make this concrete, let's imagine that we've got two regional banks, right? Regional Bank A and Regional Bank B. And at Regional Bank A, we see that the volume of complaints that we're getting about this bank is holding steady at about 500 in year 1 and in year 2. In contrast, regional bank B, we see that in year 1, we get 50 complaints from them. And in year 2, we get 500 complaints from them, about them, excuse me. And absent any other information, you might think to yourself, something's going on at regional bank 2. We should probably take a closer look at what they're doing over there. And so that would be like a reasonable thing to think, given just this information. But the problem is we don't have a lot of the extra information that could tell us a lot about why this could be occurring. So if I were to tell you that bank B serves a community that received affordable, reliable broadband at the end of year 1, that might change how you interpret these two numbers. And instead of saying like, okay, we're going to devote all our resources to looking at what's going on with regional bank B, you might now say like, okay, well, maybe we should split up our resources some other way. So our study is designed to help us understand the sorts of personal and circumstantial factors that could lead people to be more or less likely to submit complaints. And our goals here, we really got two broad ones. So the first is kind of like a long-term pie-in-the-sky vision of what we'd like to do here. And that is that we'd like to get a set of weights that can be used so that people could adjust analyses of complaint data to account for various forms of selection bias that are in the complaint data themselves. That's a big, complicated, long-term project. We're not there yet. So instead, the project I'm going to talk to you about today is really like our first step on that road. We're going to quantify the characteristics of selection bias for one product over the course of 1 year. And then based on how that goes, then we can say like, okay, is it really realistic to do this bigger project? Or like, how might we change our approach if we're going to do the bigger version? Okay, so, and the way to do this, we're going to use a methodology called case control design. So these methods were originally developed and popularized in epidemiology to study rare diseases. If there are any epidemiologists or epidemiological trained folks in the room, I'm so sorry. I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, but I'm going to do my best. Yeah, so these methods were originally developed to study rare diseases. Complaining to CFPB is not a rare disease, but it is pretty rare. People in 2022, we got about 1.3 million complaints at the Bureau. And that sounds like a lot, and it is a lot of complaints, but you have to keep in mind that the population that we're taking these complaints from is, basically American adults, of which there's about 250 million. And so if we wanted to know how people were selecting into our complaint program from that general population, and we were to just do the kind of naive thing and like, we'll just go out and take a random sample of American adults and see how many of people in that random sample submitted a complaint, it wouldn't work that well, right? Because in order to get one person that submitted a complaint to the CFPB, we'd have to get something like 250 people just in the general population. And finding one person that submits a complaint for a quantitative survey like this is not going to be particularly useful, right? We need like a few hundred people at least, if not maybe closer to 1,000 or 2,000, to really make any kind of interesting or informative statements about what our population looks like or like what's going on in the complaint data. And so we would have to, you can kind of do the mental math here. We'd have to collect tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of responses, which is just not a good use of anybody's time, the American public, ours. That's a waste of time and resources. And it'd be cost prohibitive. We are attached to the Fed. And so the funding structure is a little bit weird, but even so, we are still concerned about costs. So we use case control methodology to help us understand this kind of selection by instead what we're going to do is we're going to sample two separate groups of people. So we're going to sample cases and we're going to sample controls. And in our case, cases are people who have already submitted a complaint to us. So they came to the Bureau, submitted a complaint. We have some of their contact information just by virtue of them going through the complaint process. So that's going to be one sample. The other sample is going to be our controls. So these are individuals who are comparable to those who have submitted a complaint insofar as they have had a problem with a financial product or service, but they never actually submitted a complaint with us. So these are two groups of people who both have had issues with their financial products. One group submitted a complaint to us, the other group didn't. What we're going to do is look at how these two groups differ to make some kind of judgments of what kinds of people are getting into our program and what kinds of people aren't. And so again, to make this more concrete and to go to another hypothetical example, let's say that we were interested in people who said that they had a problem with a purchase shown on their statement. And we have the cases, so these are the people who complain. And when we go out and survey them, we find that about 30% of them report being younger than 26. So, so that's for our cases, the people who have submitted complaints. In contrast, our controls, so these are people who are from the general population who also had problems with their car, had this issue, problem with a purchase shown on their statement, but they did not submit a complaint. And in that group, we find that only 10% of those people reported being younger than 26. So given this, what we would say is that age is a risk factor for submitting a complaint about this issue, because being younger than 26 is associated with submitting a complaint. One important caveat here is that this approach can't tell us anything about causality. We're only looking at associations here, so we can't say that like being younger causes people to submit complaints. There could be other things that are going on that are leading to that behavior. Okay, so for the work I'm going to describe to you today, like I said, we've been using this kind of effort as sort of a pilot to really understand whether we can like do the bigger version of this. And so rather than talk to you about a big survey where we're covering all the products covered by the CFPB, instead we're going to focus on credit card users who have experienced a problem related to their credit card in the previous 12 months. And then for the people in the general public, we're also surveying them and asking them whether they have had an issue with their credit card. And we're using these sets of issues. So these are taken directly from the CFPB complaint form. So the people who submit complaints identify which of these issues they've had. And then the people in the general public, we ask them, hey, have you had any of these problems with your credit card in the previous 12 months? Okay, so here's some actual study details. And before I go any further, I need to point out that we only just received the data for the study on Friday. So there's still some like steps we're going to take with respect to weighting that could shift some of the results I'm going to show you a little bit. I doubt it's going to be like huge shifts, but just watch this space if you're interested in how these results might update. Anyway, so this figure shows that we've got the way that we're going about this, as I said, we're sampling from this population of Americans with credit cards. And there's really two arms to this study. So this top arm, we've got the CFPB complaint database. So these are people who have submitted a complaint to the Bureau. We're expecting basically all of them to have issues. What we see is that there's 71 people who say that they don't have an issue in our complaint data. What we think this is like, because we're asking them about this 12-month window, by the time we like sent out the survey to people, some of the people who had a problem that was maybe about 12 months ago, they have kind of aged out. As I said, we got the data on Friday, so we're still like trying to figure out why exactly this 71 I mean, it's not surprising that it's not 0. Usually some people like misremember and things like that. That's a little bit higher than we would want. So we're still in the process of figuring that out. But then we have this other arm to our study. So this is, we've taken them from an AmeriSpeak panel, and these are people who have a credit card, but they did not submit any complaints to the Bureau. And then before we can determine whether they're eligible for the full study, they answer a few questions about their credit card. And we figure out whether they have had an issue or not in the previous 12 months. And really one of the first findings that we've got from this study is that about 50% of people say that they've had an issue with their credit card in the previous 12 months, which is like kind of surprising. I was not prepared for the number to be that high. I would think maybe more like 20 or 30%, something like that. 50% of American adults say that they have had an issue, one of those issues with their credit card in the previous 12 months. That's, to me, pretty surprising. Okay, so then we have those two samples of people where this is overview of the survey instrument. We ask them about a few general topic areas, including like, what are you doing with your credit card? What's your, do you carry unpaid balances? Those sorts of questions. We ask a set of attitude and perceptions questions. Those are mostly attitudes and perceptions about their cards, as well as about the banks that are providing those cards. We ask them what details of the problem that they had, right? Because most of these people have responded saying that they have had an issue. And then we ask them a standardized validated stress appraisal measure that we modified slightly so that it makes sense in the context of our study, and some demographic questionnaires. Okay, so here's the first figure of results. Each of these figures is going to look pretty similar. So I'm going to take some extra time on this one to kind of help you figure out how to read it, and then we can just step through the other ones a little more quickly. So the first thing I want you to do is focus on the green dots. So that's the CFPB samples. Those are people who have submitted complaints to us. And what we're seeing is that about close to 60% of that sample reports being male, and close to 40% of that sample reports being female. So that's what we see if we look in the complaint data. If we look at the other data that is representative of the general population of American adults with credit cards who have had an issue in the previous 12 months, that sample has almost, what is that? Almost 55% of that sample reports being female, and a little less than 45% reports being male. So the way that we can interpret this is to look at that our CFPB sample has the green dot over here is above the orange dot. So we would say that males are overrepresented in our complaint data and that females are underrepresented, right? And so that's how I want you to read these plots. If the green dot's above, that particular group is overrepresented. If it's below, that particular group is underrepresented. Moving on to race and ethnicity. So we see that white non-Hispanics are overrepresented in the complaint data a little bit, and Hispanics and Black non-Hispanics tend to be underrepresented slightly in our complaint data. This is not particularly surprising. Those are two groups who have historically, there's historical kind of like distrust of government amongst those two groups of folks. So it's not surprising that in a sample of government data, they would be underrepresented. We do the same thing for age. So we can see that young folks don't like to use this all that much. The middle-aged to slightly less than elderly. I don't know how to really characterize those groups. Anyways, those folks are more likely to submit complaints to us than the folks in the general, than they would given their proportional representation of the general population. Not every variable that we look at shows selection bias. So this is veteran status, and we see that right here, the CFPB data seems to match pretty well the rate of veteran to non-veteran in the general population. Folks who have a lot of credit cards also tend to submit complaints to the CFPB, where those who have only one or two tend to not. And then finally, if we asked people how many times they contacted their credit card company in the last 12 months. So if you're talking to your credit card company a lot, probably not very happy about doing that. And so you tend to be overrepresented in the complaint data. Whereas if you don't talk to them all that much, we don't see those people as often as we might expect to. Okay, so like I said, we just got these data on Friday. So those are basically the first few variables that I just scraped off the top and was like, okay, what do we have here? What can we see? So we have lots more to explore, but the message so far that we're seeing is that there are some large differences in who does and does not submit complaints to the Bureau. And folks who, both at the Bureau and elsewhere, who are just kind of using these data and kind of making generalizations about the rest of the population, really need to pause and consider how this could affect some of the work that they're doing. So we think that this is super interesting and exciting, and eventually, we think that this sort of work will dramatically increase the utility of the complaint data that we've got. And I also think that if you are working in a space where you've got a program or initiative or something that you think could be characterized by selection bias, these case control surveys are really cost-efficient, effective ways of understanding how people are getting into your sample, your group. So looking ahead, we've got a few kind of concrete deliverables in the next few months, including a paper and analysis to determine how crazy that second phase is. So the idea is that we're in the second phase, we would want to cover not just credit cards, but all the products that CFPB regulates, and for a longer period of time. Again, that's kind of pie in the sky and down the road, but that's one of the things that we're hoping to do. I'm sure I'll be giving flavors of this talk in the DC area for the next, I don't know, umpteen months. So come see more of me if you really like. And yeah, with that, I'd like to thank my team, my division, the RGov organizers, our partners on collecting the data for the survey, and you for listening to me today. Thanks.